Right, we have 20 minutes together and 2 parts to this. And the whole goal is to impart some learnings and best practices on building great products, and then they'll be on fundraising. Great, and as mentioned, I live in San Francisco. I launched a venture capital fund. I lived in India for 2010 to 2012 for 2 years, and I invested in 5 companies, launched a venture fund, and part of the fund is investing in companies here, startups in India. So great. So again, 2 parts of this presentation. So let's get into product management best practices. And I think, when we think of product, we have this myth of the great leader. There's Steve Jobs, and he's amazing. I mean, we have a lot to be thankful from his product, and they're a true visionary. But, if you try to run your product teams like that, so the great leader from above, it's problematic because most of product development, actually, the reality is user-focused, user-centric design, and I will get into more details, give you some practical examples of that. And, however, whoops. Let's move on. What's going on here? Okay, got it. All right, but you need the elements of Steve Jobs. We'll get this right. One thing that he really had amazing was passion, really caring. Not just caring, but really caring about the product experience, and users had an incredible attention to detail and love for products. But you also need the right process. People don't want to hear about process in startups. They're all about passion and all that, but the process is important. That's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about basically first my background, which was I had over 21 years of experience in startups and tech companies before launching the venture fund. Started in the 90s, I was at Microsoft as a product manager and worked on some server applications. I was at a company that was backed by Benchmark Capital. We sold for a couple $100 million. We had a successful exit. Started in '99, and I was CEO of a company, and I thought I did a decent job. We had a great product teams, built products. Companies had successful exits. But then I went to Zynga, and Mark Pincus, and he's amazing, and he's good at many things, and data-driven product management, and that's some of the lessons I'm going to impart today. And in the early days of Zynga, there were at least 5 venture-backed companies, direct competitors. And I remember in the early days, Mark said, look, basically, don't think you're going to be smarter than them. Don't think you're going to work harder. The only thing we can do, and the way we can win, is to get to the right answer faster. Get to the right answer faster. Think about that. So that became kind of the mantra. And that's what this process that I'm going to talk to you about is about. And how do you get to the right answer faster? There are 4 steps, and this is just my view of looking at product management, but there's 4 stages of product management. You have to have your list of what you're going to build. That is product strategy. Come up with the list. Number 2 is you have to write the features so that the makers, the engineers and artists and UX design and everybody else can execute that. You have to project manage it to launch, and then you analyze what you've done, right? So let's just say that's one way of looking at it. Now let's go through each one, and I'll do it briefly, and most of the time will be spent on product strategy. How do you pick the right things to do? And first, before you do this, you have to get in the service mindset. The challenge I've found that at companies with product management is that product management has huge influence in a company. And many times, the founder of the company comes from that background. They've been a product manager before they start a company. Maybe they were engineers in product management, start the company. So product managers are a big deal. And it's very easy to get there's quite a lot of authority and power that you have in a company. And you have to get out of that mindset. You have to change your mind. You have to first think that I serve, and you serve 2 people, 2 groups. First, you serve the customers, and you have to be the voice of the customers. And I'm going to talk about how challenging that is. It's easy to say, and I'm going to talk about specifically some things you can do to make them more reality. But then you've got to serve the makers. And how many people have written code in this room? I've done something in an academic setting. It's really hard. And debugging code is even harder, right? And so every hour of engineering time should be considered like gold. And as a product manager, you serve them. So your specs have to be good. If your specs are loosey-goosey and a waste time of the engineers, you're not serving them. So your mindset, they don't serve you. You know what I mean? You serve them. You serve the customers, and you serve the makers. The makers can be the UX designers, the writers, the marketing people, but especially the engineers, and making sure that their time is most effectively used. So once you have that mindset, now we can start approaching about how to deliver great products. So again, back to the 4 steps. So what are the steps? First is coming up with a list. Every company has a list. It is easy to come up with a list. In fact, you can come up with a list of 100 features, and you can pick 10 that you're going to do this quarter. That's the easy part, but how do you do it well? How do you do it effectively? There are 3 problems, 3 common errors that I have seen product teams that I have done myself. I have been in the room, I have managed the teams, and I have invested in companies, and they all make these errors. They are super common. And how do you avoid those? And I'm going to talk about that right now. So one of them is, why are these errors common? Why does all these teams make it? And, we're talking about smart. We're talking about people who are smart, they're diligent, they're customer-focused, data-driven. These are product managers who are passionate and they're trying. So why do they still make these errors? That's because this is what a typical room looks like for your weekly product meeting, right? In startups, you know this. You have your weekly product meeting, you get around the room, and everyone is focused, but why does this happen? Well, a lot of it happens because who's in that room? It's often just the product managers. And by the way, this can be for a division of the company. This can be, the product manager and the CEO. If it's a division, maybe it's the general manager or the VP or whatever. This can be at any scales, but that's who is in the room, all right? And maybe the head of engineering or maybe the head of design. But who is not in the room? Most team members are not real users of your product, okay? Unless it's some consumer product like Facebook. I didn't work at Facebook, but that would be a product what I would use. I have intuition. But I've worked in enterprise software, and I'm telling you, the people in that room are not, IT managers installing server application software. So it's rare that, the people in that room, people at the company, are the real users of the product, okay? It's really only the case for some consumer products. And the real users can be very far away and not at the table. So what do? You bring the teams closest to the users into that room. It sounds very basic, but almost no teams that do it. When you walk in those meetings, it's almost all product managers, and there's hardly people close to it. Who is close to the customers? The customer service team. Customer success, if you're a SaaS company, for instance. There's community management, if you're maybe one of these community sites. There's people who talk to customers every single day. And in every company that I've seen, the customer support people are almost never in that room, right? Because they're customer support team. In fact, many of them are not even in the building. They get the other real estate, the office across the road, right? You got to bring them in, and I'm going to give you some examples. This was a game that I managed at Zynga in India. We brought the game over to manage. That's what we did. The company was growing very quickly, and we had to scale, and so we grew a very big and great team here in Bangalore. And so we had to move some of the games, just we were growing so quickly. And this was a game that had been around 4 years before it came over. And, and I'm not trying to toot my horn, I'm just trying to give you examples. And I had this thing where I was going to bring in the customer into that room. So I brought the customer service team into that room and said, tell me, on the roadmap, you get a feature. They'd never been asked that. I said, in fact, I'll give you 3 this quarter. What's the first thing you want to do? And they say, it's obvious. Inventory search. So this was a game where you had a virtual world and you had characters, you dressed up, and every couple of days, twice a week, we introduced new content, new clothes, new things. So active users, remember, who were not usually the team members, but these active users for years in their inventory of items. Some of them had 10,000 clothes and hats, and there was no way to search. Inventory search, very basic. The customer service team had wanted this for 4 years, but nobody had asked them. And, so this inventory search, one feature of the year, by the way, when we launched it, they were able to, customer self. So why was it not done? The challenge with not doing features like that is that they're too small. So the 3 problems that you make when you do prioritization is you don't do features small enough, you don't do features big enough, and you're not objective enough, too subjective. So why is it you don't do small enough? Because in product management, you want to move the needle. What are the metrics? Is it going to, revenue? Is it going to do, retention? Is it going to monetization? All these metrics. And inventory search really wasn't going to do those. But what you find is that you have to I'll go back to small enough, is that you build up product debt. You build up in every company, tech debt and product debt. And every quarter, my recommendation is that you take a couple of small features and you trim that, because the users will notice that. They will notice it and you trim that debt, right? Things like inventory search, very basic, and the users loved it and didn't really move the needle on anything. It wasn't everything we did, but we made sure every quarter we were addressing the top things. Not some bug where we had to, but just trimming that product debt. So that's the first thing. Not thinking small enough. What's another error? Is not thinking big enough. So what does this mean? You know, everyone likes to think that they're thinking big. You know, we're visionary, we're going to go for it. But it's very hard to do once you've launched the product. So what do I mean when you launch a product? When you haven't launched your product, you have a very clear vision of what that product's going to be for V1. But when you're in year 2 or 3 after the version, it's really hard. Because do we go and focus on our power users, or do we focus more on, you know, Twitter's facing that right now. Do they face on the users who are not logged in, that have bounced off Twitter, or do they more go for the power users? And, you know, after a couple years, you know, it's hard to know which direction. And so what happens is you end up doing a lot of little things. You end up doing everything, right? A little bit for our power users, a little for the first users, and you don't really nail a longer-term vision and move towards it. It's very hard to do. And I found one technique that actually can make this happen, and that is making a one-slide visualization of your product direction. Now, I was taking a course at Stanford where I went, and IDEO came in. It was a human computer interaction course. IDEO came in and presented this, and I thought it was a bunch of, you know, I wouldn't say MBA speak, but whatever, like corporate speak. They work with big customers, but I was then at a company years later and was facing this dilemma running a product team. And I went and dug out that presentation on a piece of paper, actually, and used it with this team, and it actually really worked. Because what you have to do is you have to summarize where your product's going in a one slide. Imagine doing that. Almost nobody does that once the product's launched. And it could be a 2x2 matrix saying, you know, we're over here now, and for the next year, we're going to move from here to here. It could be steps in the process. I did this once with a team, and we focused one quarter on one area where we were weak, then another area, you know. So the advantage of having a visual slide is that it's easy to communicate. It gets everyone literally on the same page, and almost nobody does it. I walk into companies, I say, tell me, sketch for me what your product is, where it's going, what you are. And, you know, people will give words. Our mission is to empower the, yeah, blah, 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 blah. But to write it down actually is hard. It took us, product team, 3 weeks to come up with a visual. We had to go interview customers. We'd unearth issues. We had to debate but once we were synced, it led to all these insights. So once you do that, this is another example, actually, and Mark Pincus was great at this. He had the same insight from a different perspective. He had this idea of movie poster. Tell me where your game is going to be in 1 year, and do the poster of where that's going to be. Imagine that. Like, do the visual of where you're going to be in 1 year, and then make sure every quarter you do 1 or 2 big features to get there. So it was the same idea, right? Do a visual representation and work backwards, and that's what I'm talking about. And so this was an example. Again, you know, there's a lot of meaning here, actually, if you know the game, because we sort of focused on a couple of areas and then went deep in them. And what I recommend companies do is put it on the wall. Most companies, the walls look like over there, blank, you know, not being used. But a company that does this right will be able to put the product vision on the wall, and everybody every day, okay, this is where we're going. And then they'll come up with some big features, making sure. So if you think of a roadmap has to be a map to somewhere, right? So if you don't have the vision, how do you have the roadmap? And then it just becomes a list of features, and becomes who argues the best and who's in that room, and then, you know, pet projects, and that's how that list gets together. What I'm suggesting is if you have, let's say you have 12 features you're going to do this quarter, right? Do 3 of them as small things that trim the product debt. Do 2 or 3 big features that move you towards this vision that you've laid out for the next year or 2. And then you can do some middle things or try some other ideas, and that's your roadmap. And that's, to me, a more complete roadmap. All right, so that's what I would suggest, is you do every quarter at least 1 bold feature to move towards this vision. So that's the next thing. And then the third era is subjective versus objective. And this is where what gets on the roadmap becomes a function of who can argue the best, or someone's title. So the CEO, right? You get to do the pet project. Everybody in the room thinks it's a dumb idea, but it's the CEO. Okay, we'll let this. You know what? Users don't care. They do not care whether you look good in front of the CEO because you let them do that project. So you've got to avoid the flavor of the day, the pet projects, and it's very hard to do that. The really only way that you can do that is if you have some sort of objective criteria. And you've got to do something where you say, okay, what is the expected results of this? So the CEO comes, I got this idea that, this big, great. Every week, we have a one page that you can submit with your expected results and then some estimate of the dev cost. And, guess what? They'll probably come, and you say, great, love you, come present next week, right? Guess what? 9 out of 10 times they won't come, right? Because it's just the idea and throwing. Now, I'm not saying you don't listen, you don't have brainstorming. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying to get on the roadmap, remember to take the time of the makers, of the engineers. You want to have some things vetted. And if you have a process that can make sure that you get to the right answer faster, not the person who has the biggest title, you will have some process like this. So this is an example from a product I'm on, and it uses some language and very specific daily active users and click-through rates. But the point is you can do it. Now, I always hear objections to this, saying, well, this is an example from a feature that was the version 2 of a feature, so you had some metrics. But what I'm doing is innovative, right? I have no metrics. Well, you know what? You see the second point? You can always have metrics. You can always have something. It could be something brand new, but you know what you could say? We have a user council. We have 5 power users, and we have a special file folder for them that's special. And we'll put up a mock-up of these, and we'll have them vote. You can get there. That's something. If 3 or 5 of them, 4 or 5 have to say that they want to do it before, you get some input. Or you can just have pieces of paper of your feature, and you go around and show 10 people in the office. The idea is that you're trying to get to the right answer faster. Remember, you're trying to get objective and get some input. So it can be from piece of paper all the way to A/B testing, and all this other much more advanced sort of metrics that you can get. But you can get something that equalizes, what this has done. So then that's around product strategy. That's the main stuff. You get that right, you're along the way. The rest is, I'm going to just very quickly cover product design. That's writing specs, right? That's writing on paper. It's a lot easier to make mistakes or to iterate on paper than in code. And it's even better if you can do a prototype, because many things require interaction. So you hire a Java, maybe a lower level engineer, and that stuff can save a lot of time. So just the key points, write it down. I hear teams all the time. We sit next to the engineers. We're a small team. We don't need specs. Well, you know what? How many of you remember Windows? I worked at Microsoft. That era, the hex code memory is out of, remember that kind of stuff? I mean, why? Because at 2 in the morning, some engineer was coding away with a spec, and they hit a corner case, and there was nothing in there about it. So they write the truth. The hex code was out of memory. But humans, real people don't even know what that means. The product manager should have written some error message, right, and put it in the code. So your spec should be super complete. It saves people time. It's the right way to do it. You iterate often. It's on paper, and enables the makers to get their job done. Project management, very basic stuff. There's obviously a lot more on this. You don't need fancy software. You just need to communicate well. And one of the things that really works well, of course, are daily meetings. But also when you have a meeting, and let me just be clear, people are like, we don't have meetings in our company. Okay, whatever. I mean, meetings can be effective, okay? But one of the things you want to do at the end of a meeting is you want to have somebody just write up an email. And it's remarkable how often this does not happen. In fact, it rarely happens. And all you do in the email is you say attendees, date, attendees, discussed, decided. Because what happens is you're in this meeting, and you're 3 weeks into a 6-week shipping of this feature, and the engineer 2 weeks later comes and says, here's what you wanted from that meeting. We adjusted this. You say, no, we discussed that, but we decided that. You don't want to have that discussion, right? You want to make it very clear. So in your email, you say, we discussed this, we decided this has changed, this hasn't. because people don't always get it from the meeting. They're confused about discussions versus decision. So you make it just very clear, and you have to be willing to make trade-offs to ship your product. And then there's analytics. There's a whole lot of stuff on this. Let me just say that the key is to review the metrics regularly. Let me just tell you one of the best practices that we had at Zynga that I rarely, if ever, have seen in another company is reviewing the metrics after the launch. What do I mean? The weekly product meeting, I can tell you what it is every company. People get on the whiteboard. They think about the next big feature. There's ideation, and that's all great. You still want that. But you know what? The next week, here's our roadmap, and then we ship this. And then the next week, here's what we're going to do in the future. Here's what we're doing in the next month. What about what you just shipped? Did it work? Should you do it more of it? What lessons did you learn? And what the real, I tell you, the insight that Mark had was he separated the meetings. He created a special meeting. He had one meeting for the product meeting, what you're going to do, the roadmap. He had another meeting, which was the review meeting. And I tell you, I've never seen a company do it like this. He made the product managers prepare PowerPoints, like 20 slides, 30 slides every week. And it's very basic. One is you have a couple of metrics that you look at every week, but the real meat of it was the second part. What launched? Okay? And in it, you describe the feature, but then what you do is you put the expected results, and what do you put right next to it on the same slide? Actual results. And then what's the next section? Lessons learned. And it's very important, critical, that this does not become an exercise in product managers trying to defend themselves. Oh, it didn't, this, and massage the data. It has to be an honest discussion. What did we learn? As a team, can we get better? Maybe the forecast was wrong. Maybe this feature was better than we thought it was. Was that because we didn't forecast it well enough? Maybe there's a gem here. Maybe it was worse. The only time that I ever see this happen is when something big goes wrong. And then everyone says, let's do a post-mortem. And it becomes a big, right? A big finger pointing. If you have it every week where it's a culture of what did we learn? They should come in and say, you know what, I was wrong. Here's why I was wrong, and let's all learn together. Then you've won as a company. Now that's real culture. And that's how you build great products, and that's where you compare actual to expected, and you write down the lessons. So that's it on product management. Very little bit on fundraising, because we're just running out of time. But the basics apply in the US or India. Okay, it doesn't matter. You're trying to build unicorns. You have venture capitalists. They have to return money to limited partners. So there's not a lot of, we're all in Silicon Valley together. You have to create, when you're fundraising, a sense of scarcity. You have to make the process time-bound. People have to feel that, like, it's competitive. You don't want to be proactive. Don't just have a VC wants to have lunch with you and, you have to, like, share what you're doing. You know what? You can say, great, we'll have lunch. I'm not ready to fundraise. I'll get to know you, but I'll call you when I'm ready. You have to have that discipline. So you run a process, and you have to have great materials. For God's sake, run a biographic designer. I mean, the stuff I see in India, it looks like people created on their own computer, and do it. I've got one more slide. Yeah. One thing I will hide, this is my last slide, is that AngelList Syndicate's a game changer. And as Indian startups, I don't know if you know how to tap that. It's not just AngelList where you can go find investors. These are people, and there's about 165 of them, and a lot of them are Silicon Valley insiders, where they set up, they're getting a deal, and then they go get people to invest through them. And they're often well-known people, and they have people backing them. In fact, AngelList just raised $400 million to back syndicates. So if you were looking to raise, you should think about, and maybe there's Indian, I don't know, all the syndicates. Maybe there's ones that will do deals here. Maybe there's ones that won't. But this is a real game changer, I think, for early, especially seed-stage funding. And it's a bigger game changer, I think, than people realize right now. Also, accelerators, there's hundreds of them. You can apply. There's the big ones you've heard, Y Combinator. But there's many others, and there's also a very vertical one. Highway 1 is just for hardware companies. They have a factory in China. They take you over as part of the program, and they actually help you build it. Alchemist is for enterprise only. So there's some ones, and they love to get, they want diversity. They want startups from all over the world. So from India, you should look at all these ones, and not just Y Combinator. And that's it. And Team Builder Ventures is this fund where, for startups in India, I can help with U.S. introductions and U.S. information. This is just the final. It's a service venture fund. We've done deals. These are some of the companies I've helped, introductions in the U.S., like Miss Malini and Zipdal. I've invested with some great investors in a bunch of companies here, and just invested in ZipGo, and have all Silicon Valley insiders have backed the fund. This is not from institutions. So founders of all these great companies, head of Airbnb, one of the top people at Airbnb, head of Corp Dev at Uber, the lean startup person, all these people are investors in the fund. So if you've got a great startup, you know, come find me. Thank you.